All right, today we are diving deep into one of the most chaotic, most influential, and frankly bloodiest turning points in all of history, the French Revolution. We're going to explore how a world-changing cry for liberty and equality somehow spiraled into a paranoid reign of terror. Let's get into it. So let's start with the big question that really sits at the heart of this whole story. How on earth does a nation go from having a king who is believed to rule by the will of God to publicly executing that same king by guillotine in just 4 years? I mean, that's an incredibly short amount of time. The answer, as you can imagine, is complicated, but it all starts with a society that was fundamentally and dangerously broken. To get to the heart of this, you have to look at how French society was set up. It was split into 3 groups, or estates. You had the first estate, which was the clergy, and the second estate, the nobility. Together, they made up a tiny fraction of the population, maybe 3% total. Everyone else, and I mean everyone, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest farmer, was crammed into the third estate. That's 97% of the people. And this insane inequality wasn't just social, it was deeply political. So before things completely blew up, we need to talk about the powder keg it was all sitting on. This was France's old regime, a whole system of tradition and privilege that was honestly about to collapse under its own weight. Okay, and here's where that political unfairness just becomes so obvious it's painful. When the king needed to raise money, he'd call the estates general, which was kind of like a parliament. But here's the catch. Each estate got only 1 vote. So the clergy and the nobility, that tiny 3% who usually agreed on everything, could always outvote the 97%, 2-1. It meant the vast majority of France had absolutely no real power to change anything. Reform was basically impossible. On top of this broken system, you had a perfect storm of crises brewing. The government was drowning in debt from expensive wars, including helping to fund the American Revolution, ironically. And guess who paid the taxes? Not the wealthy first and second estates. No, they were exempt. The whole burden fell on the third estate. And then people were literally starving. Bad harvests meant the price of bread, the main food for most people, went through the roof. And simmering underneath all of this were these radical new ideas from the Enlightenment, ideas about liberty, equality, and the rights of man. So, all of this brings us to the first phase of the revolution. This is the period from about 1789 to 1791, where it really seemed like a better, fairer France could be built not with violence, but with ideas, with laws, with powerful words. This was the optimistic phase. And things happened so fast. I mean, 1789 was the year the old world just completely shattered. In June, the Third Estate basically hijacks the government. In July, the people of Paris storm the Bastille prison, a huge symbol of the king's power. And by August, they've written a whole new set of rules for society. It was just one seismic event after another. So what happened was, the Third Estate's representatives get locked out of their usual meeting hall. What do? They just find an indoor tennis court nearby, gather together, and swear an oath that they won't stop meeting until they've written a new constitution for France. Historians have called this an act of unprecedented chutzpah, and they're right. They were basically looking at the king and saying, "You're not the government anymore, we are." Then came this, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It's this incredible document, kind of like France's version of the Declaration of Independence. It stated that rights like liberty and equality were for everyone, and it completely abolished the idea that you were important just because of the family you were born into. This wasn't just a reform, it was a direct assault on the entire structure of the old regime, a total game changer. And all this incredible work led to the Constitution of 1791. It was this huge victory. France was no longer an absolute monarchy. It was now a constitutional monarchy. That meant the king wasn't above the law anymore. He had to follow it, just like everybody else. For a moment there, it really seemed like the revolution had succeeded. But, as we'll see, the story was far from over. Yeah, because all of that progress was about to take a seriously dark and violent turn. The revolution entered what we now call the radical phase, where those beautiful ideals of 1789 got twisted into a justification for absolute state-sponsored terror. You can just see the stark contrast here. The goal went from simply limiting the king's power to getting rid of the monarchy altogether and creating a radical republic. The people in charge shifted from the more moderate National Assembly to a zealous political club called the Jacobins. And, maybe most chillingly of all, the weapon of choice went from laws and declarations to the guillotine. So, The Jacobins and their infamous leader Maximilien Robespierre came to believe the revolution was in mortal danger. They saw enemies absolutely everywhere. Spies from other countries, nobles still loyal to the king, even people who just weren't enthusiastic enough. And their argument was simple. To save the revolution, we have to destroy anyone and everyone who might stand in its way. And destroy them they did. The Jacobins created this thing called the Committee of Public Safety, and with it, they unleashed the Reign of Terror. In less than 2 years, an estimated 40,000 people were executed, often with no real trial. All you had to do was be accused of being an enemy of the revolution. It was a complete bloodbath, fueled by paranoia. This radicalism wasn't just happening at home either. To fight off other European kingdoms who were, terrified of these revolutionary ideas spreading, the Jacobins created the Levée en masse, a mass draft. This was the first time in modern history an entire nation was mobilized for war. It created the biggest army Europe had ever seen, and their job wasn't just to defend France, but to export the revolution by force. But here's something that often gets left out of the history books. This was not just a revolution run by men in meeting halls. To really understand what happened, you have to look at the people on the streets. And at every single crucial moment, women played a vital and too often forgotten role. Let's go back to 1789 for one of the most incredible moments. Thousands of Parisian women, many of them fish ladies known for being tough, got fed up with the price of bread. So they marched 12 miles in the pouring rain to the lavish palace of Versailles. They confronted the king and queen, and they literally physically forced the royal family to pack up and move back to Paris, where the people could keep an eye on them. It was this incredible display of popular power, and it was led by women. And it wasn't just action in the streets, there was intellectual action too. When that famous Declaration of the Rights of Man came out, the playwright Olympe de Gouges immediately saw the hypocrisy. So she wrote her own version, the Declaration of the Rights of Woman. She demanded full equal rights, powerfully pointing out that a revolution for liberty that left out half the population was no revolution at all. So, after all of that chaos, the hope, the bloodshed, what did the French Revolution actually leave us with? Well, its legacy is both incredibly inspiring and absolutely terrifying, and there's no question that it changed the world forever. So what are the big things to take away from all this? First, the deep systemic inequality of the old regime just couldn't last. It was a system doomed to fail. Second, the revolution completely changed our idea of power. It shifted it away from one king who ruled by God's will to the people themselves. It introduced the world to the foundational ideas of liberty and equality. But, and this is a big but, it's also a chilling warning that the passionate, all-consuming pursuit of a perfect world can lead directly to terror and violence. And that leaves us with this huge, final question to think about. There's no doubt the French Revolution put the ideals of modern democracy and human rights on the world stage. But it did so by unleashing unimaginable violence. And so we have to ask ourselves, was the cost worth it? It's a question that historians, and all of us, are still wrestling with today.